Hey y'all, what's going on? Professor Barth here, history professor at Arizona State University. It's great to be back. I've got an important subject today that I want to give a lecture on, and that is freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech is a quintessential foundation of the American system, and it is also, even more broadly than that, a bedrock principle of any liberal governing order. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to use the word liberal here and there quite a few times, and it's important right now to establish what I mean by liberal or by liberalism. And for the purposes of this lecture, I'm using liberal in the classical sense. Liberalism as an order that places an exceptionally high value on civil liberties. And civil liberties include not just freedom of speech, but also freedom of religion, due process of law, freedom of the press, freedom to petition, right to bear arms. And I recognize that people will dispute about where you draw the line on the right to bear arms, but nonetheless, just that basic principle. And basically anything you find in the Bill of Rights falls under this just classical liberal order. Think of it this way: liberalism as the opposite of an authoritarian regime. Okay? So freedom of speech is again a bedrock principle of any liberal governing order, and for that reason, this is a subject that transcends the left-right paradigm. You can be on the left, you can be on the right. Historically, if you are liberally minded, freedom of speech is something that you cherish. Now, there have been periods of history in which freedom of speech was championed primarily by the left, while encountering some hostility and sometimes a lot of hostility from the right. There have also been other periods, and I would say unequivocally that we're in one of those right now, where freedom of speech is primarily championed by the right and has encountered greater hostility, with some very notable exceptions, from the left. Those are generalities. Nonetheless, I think those are that is typically true, and it usually depends, this left-right question, usually depends on which side is in power and which side is out of power. Who holds the levers of power? When the right control, the right wing controls most institutions of political, economic, or cultural significance, the left is usually more likely to champion free speech. When it's the reverse and the left controls most political, economic, or cultural institutions, you're generally going to find free speech championed by the right. Hopefully, those of you who are watching this video would champion it irrespective of whether or not your particular party or political standpoint, viewpoint, worldview is in power. Let me give you an example of when the left championed free speech and perhaps the right was more reticent. There are the famous student protests at the University of California, Berkeley, in 1964 going on into 1965. Pictured here was one of the leaders of that movement, Mario Savio. And at UC-Berkeley, students were protesting the university's ban on on-campus political activities, student speech, academic freedom. And it was a huge, huge movement that then incited other like movements on other college campuses. It was heavily influenced by the New Left, as they were called, civil rights movement, the early women's movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. Freedom of speech really takes off as an important movement in modern America. We'll talk about where freedom of speech is today later, but before we do that, let's define freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is a statement where the individual has freedom, or a group has freedom, to articulate and to disseminate their opinions or ideas without fear of legal punishment, sanction, or government censorship. Now, freedom of speech is not all oral, of course, but it also includes other media, including the written word, printed word, internet communication, and art. The freedom of speech covers not only the content, but also the means of expression. Now, there are some limitations on free speech. Let's talk about the ones that are commonly agreed upon. We'll talk about the debate about hate speech and offensive speech later in this lecture. But what are the commonly agreed upon limitations to freedom of speech? Well, most people agree that defamation is a limit, okay? Slander, libel are included under that umbrella. Now, in the United States of America, there's a very, very high bar for defamation, especially if you're a public figure. Nonetheless, if an outlet knowingly lies or recklessly disregards considering whether or not a charge is true and they print it, they can be sued for defamation. There are obscenity and indecency laws, and here there will be disagreement about what's allowed. There have been debates about pornography, but still, nonetheless, usually there's a consensus about, okay, there's a line here, you can't cross that line. Sedition, we'll look at that a little closer later. Incitement to violence. Fighting words, so-called fighting words, inciting an immediate breach of the peace. Okay, if you're to walk up to somebody, get within an inch of their face and start yelling in their face, and it looks like you're about to slug them right across the head, that you do not have that right in this country. That does not fall under freedom of speech. Classified information. If you work for an intelligence agency, you cannot appeal to freedom of speech if you release that information. Copyright violation, which I would argue is grossly abused in the United States. Nonetheless, we have copyright, non-disclosure agreements, perjury. So those do not fall under freedom of speech. Nonetheless, in the United States and in several other countries around the world, there's a broadly agreed upon consensus that you have the right, the liberty to articulate ideas without fear of censorship. Now, where do the origins of freedom of speech come from? It's hard to say exactly, but it would be a mistake to ignore Athens, ancient Athens, and the ancient Roman Republic. Athenian democracy in the 6th and 5th centuries BC encouraged, in at least an indirect manner, this some sort of principle of free speech. You have a participatory government. If you're participating in that government, you have to have some means of communicating your ideas. Roman Republic was a similar function in a similar way. There was in the Roman Republic a relatively, from a historical standpoint, high value placed upon free speech. Here is Cicero denouncing Catiline, the Catiline conspiracy in around 63, 64 BC. Nonetheless, there were limitations here. Socrates found that out the hard way. Socrates, of course, the famous philosopher in ancient Athens in the 5th century BC. He was a prominent critic of Athens, criticized its social and moral and political structures. Plato called him a gadfly, just someone who posed novel but very upsetting and inconvenient questions that challenged prevailing orthodoxy, challenged the status quo, and so he made a lot of enemies. He was 71 years old at the time that he faced trial, and he was charged with corrupting the minds of the youth. Corrupting the minds of the youth in Athens and for not believing in the gods of the state. A democratic majority declared him guilty and sentenced him to death. He was forced to drink poisoned water. So that was the end of Socrates. Not much freedom of speech involved there. And here in the story of Socrates, we see this tension between democracy and freedom of speech. In a democracy where you have majority rule, what happens to the man or to the woman who promotes ideas that are unpopular? That's a problem in a democracy. Historically, what you do then is you don't have a pure democracy, but you have a democratic republic where there are safeguards, like in our country, the First Amendment, that no matter how unpopular your idea is, it is protected. A democratic majority, small d democratic majority, cannot convict you for an unpopular idea. Moving forward about 1500 or so years, during the medieval period, obviously there's not much freedom of speech that would be altogether anachronistic to talk about. But even with the written word, there wasn't much censorship. Before the dawn of the printing press, it was very time-consuming, laborious to produce written works. If you wanted to produce a written work and then copy it, it had to be physically copied by hand, by a scribe, manually. Scribes tended to be restricted to religious institutions, so there just wasn't a whole lot of widely disseminated works that would have caused much controversy, not much censorship in the way of the printed word. That changed with the printing press in the 15th century. The Gutenberg printing press all of a sudden introduces the printed word as a highly effective means to disseminate ideas. It was the internet of the early modern period. You see the early printing press. And just to give you an idea of how revolutionary this technology was, this is European data. European output of printed books between the middle of the 15th century and 1800. Look at that. By the 16th century, 200 million copies of printed works. Now, if you're living in the 16th century, you're like, whoa, that's unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. 200 million, and that was a lot. That was a big deal. But then look at the 17th century. It jumps up to almost 500 million, or more than 500 million, actually, copies of printed books. And then by 1800, roughly 1 billion copies of printed books printed, and things were never the same. How did the ruling class respond? Well, the Vatican responded with censorship. In 1501, the Pope issued a circular against the unlicensed printing of books. And so this was a common regulation. If you want to be a printer, you have to be licensed by the state or by the church. And he issued this circular. And then in 1559, he issued an index of prohibited books, which outlined or which listed the different books that were prohibited. This this index went through 300 editions and banned or censored books written by everyone from Descartes to Galileo to John Locke to Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Voltaire, and is a classical example of attempted censorship. But it wasn't just in Catholic countries. I want to just pick on Roman Catholics. In some Protestant countries as well, there was an attempt to regulate, to censor the printed word. In 1643, Parliament passed the Licensing Act, which required printers to receive a license from the state and then suppressed scandalous or so-called seditious books. Well, the following year, in 1644, a young man named John Milton responded and through a speech, and then printed his speech in 1644. Now, John Milton is remembered as a famous poet, intellectual. He authored the famous epic poem Paradise Lost in 1667, but this is about a little more than 2 decades prior. And this was a major contribution of John Milton. John Milton in his text makes a fairly early defense of freedom of speech. And he makes it clear that when he's talking about freedom of speech, it's a multifaceted freedom for John Milton. It includes the right to seek information. It includes the right to receive information. And thirdly, it includes the right to impart information. John Milton believed that in a society of rational human beings, intelligent men ought to know why they believe what they believe and ought to take responsibility for those beliefs. And so a society, John Milton argued, the most effective society, the most highly functioning society, will be a society of open discussion in which there is a consensus that, a variety of opinions are allowed, and that man has the freedom then to consider all of those different opinions. John Milton says this in his speech: "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties." Okay? Remember that at the beginning of this video I said that freedom of speech is a bedrock principle of a liberal order. Here we have John Milton saying that this principle, he would place it above all liberties. He also had this to say: "Though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength." So what's he saying here? He's saying that these licensing laws to prevent scandalous and seditious speech are actually doubting the strength of truth. Okay? If you really believe that you have truth, you ought not doubt the strength of that true idea. "Let her and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter." Don't let some tyrant or despot or government, a state or church, decide for you what opinions you can and cannot pursue. You have the liberty to do that yourself, John Milton argues. And in fact, about half a century later, a little less than half a century later, after the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, the English Parliament passed a Bill of Rights. Yes, this is where we get our Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights came about 100 years before our own Bill of Rights. But in the English Bill of Rights, it outlined in writing the principle of freedom of speech in Parliament. Okay, in Parliament. If you're a member of Parliament, you have the right, the liberty to speak and to impart ideas according to conscience. Now, freedom of speech for the general public is not given in the English Bill of Rights. In the American Bill of Rights, it is. And also, this licensing act that John Milton so detested, it lapsed in 1695, and after 1695, printers in England no longer needed to be licensed by the government to operate. This movement toward free speech occurred around the time of the Enlightenment, this period in European history, intellectual history, in which empiricism, a whole broad range of ideas are circulating, some very good, some quite bad. But nonetheless, it was an age of ideas, an age of the intellect. John Locke, the famous English philosopher, posed that man has natural rights. Well, what were those natural rights according to John Locke? Life, liberty, and property. Liberty, part of liberty, a cornerstone, a crux of liberty, is the right to hold your own opinions, to seek information, to receive information, and to impart information. It's a key cornerstone of that natural right of liberty. There were Enlightenment thinkers elsewhere outside of England who did not have as much freedom of speech or liberty to seek alternative ideas. Voltaire was one of those. Voltaire was an 18th century French philosopher. He's very famous for his wit, his satire. He was a major advocate of freedom of religion, freedom of expression. He was a critic of the Catholic Church. And in France, for those opinions, he was imprisoned sometimes for months at a time. And in fact, in the 1720s, he was exiled for a period to England, and he was in England, but in England he had liberties that he did not enjoy in France, and was able to conduct his affairs and to pursue his intellectual opinions and other pursuits. Denis Diderot was another French philosophe in the 18th century. He was the chief editor of the Encyclopedia, and the Encyclopedia was this collection of all these different articles. It was actually on a subscription basis, so it took about 20 years, but subscribers would receive new articles from time to time. And in those he talked about natural rights, and he was critical of church and state relations. Well, this work of the Encyclopedia was suspended by the French courts for seditious content. At one point, Diderot was detained by the French police. His house was searched for additional manuscripts so that they could destroy them. He had hidden them away, however, so they weren't able to find him. But the point is, Diderot threatened the ruling class, and they tried to shut him down. In the American colonies, the English American colonies, in 1734, there was a famous trial that took place in New York City. It was the John Peter Zenger trial. And John Peter Zenger was a man who was accused of libel for criticizing the colonial governor of New York. Well, he was put on trial. Guess what? The jury acquitted, and he was found not guilty, which sent a strong message early on in what later became the United States. This is before the American Revolution, during the colonial period. But early on, this message that, hey, in these colonies, we cherish this idea of liberty of conscience, freedom of speech, without the state intervening and telling us what we must believe. Of course, in our own Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, what does Thomas Jefferson and the other signatories say? They say that we are endowed by our Creator with what? Certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, Jefferson quite obviously includes within that scope, within that umbrella, the right to liberty of conscience and the liberty of communicating those ideas and seeking out alternative ideas from others. 1791, the First Amendment is ratified. As a result of the new Constitution in 1787, there were some people who were a little nervous about the U.S. Constitution. Hey, maybe the federal government would be too powerful. The Bill of Rights was put into place in order to assure them that hey, it's okay. We will have safeguards. And what does that First Amendment say? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition a government for a redress of grievances. Thomas Jefferson, about 10 years later in 1801, had this to say about the topic: error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. And this was a very common Enlightenment ideal. Some may say utopian. Nonetheless, commonly held view during the Enlightenment and during the early, among many of the founding fathers, and not just in the United States, but also across the pond in France. When the French Revolution kicked off in the summer of 1789, the National Assembly produced a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And in that declaration, inspired by our own declaration, it said this, quote, "The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of man. Every citizen may accordingly speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law." So there's a little bit of a caveat there at the end. I might leave some room for regulation. Nonetheless, calling it one of the most precious of the rights of man. In the 20th century, The United Nations, in its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, had this to say, quote, "Everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas." Oh, where did that come from? Oh, John Milton. "Of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of his choice." Now, interestingly, a bit later, there was this declaration was amended, and it included this in the amendment. Very interesting. "The exercise of the rights provided for in this article carries with it special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary, first, for respect of the rights or reputations of others; second, for the protection of national security or of public order or of public health or morals." So this amendment pretty much watered down what preceded it. This is pretty strong. I mean, it's about as strong as you're going to get. This amendment can be interpreted by the most tyrannical dictator to suppress any speech he wants. One of the foremost defenders of freedom of speech in the 20th century was a man named Alexander Meiklejohn. And Alexander Meiklejohn emphasized the link between democracy and freedom of speech. He said that in any democracy, because democracy is self-government by the people, you've got to have an informed electorate. But to have an informed electorate, you have to have the free flow of ideas. You can't have the constraints put in, especially constraints imposed on from the top on to the electorate in order to conceal information, to repress any criticism of the government. And Meiklejohn warned that people in power, they want to do that. They would like to manipulate, but in a functioning democracy, you have to have the free flow of information and ideas. And so democracy and freedom of speech go hand in hand, Meiklejohn argued. Another advocate in the 20th century of freedom of speech was Thomas Emerson. Emerson argued essentially that freedom of speech operates within the system as a safety valve to let people let off some steam. Okay, so instead of, if you just prohibit speech and ban speech and not allow people to express, then it's like a boiling pot attempting to keep the top on, right? It's things will boil up, can have descent moves underground, and you increase the likelihood of revolution. Freedom of speech provides stability, then, from Emerson's point of view. It says the principle of open discussion is a method of achieving a more adaptable and at the same time more stable community. But the foremost defender of freedom of speech, bar none, is a 19th century liberal philosopher in England named John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is he is the man in English liberal thought. And again, here liberalism, meaning a philosophy based on liberty, consent of the governed, equality before the law, free markets, free trade, limited government, individual rights, secularism, gender equality, internationalism, freedom of speech. And yes, John Stuart Mill actually was an early advocate of extending the right to vote to women, freedom of religion. All of those things fell under the spectrum of English liberalism. Well, in 1859, John Stuart Mill published a very important book, very famous book, might be his most famous work, titled On Liberty. And in this book, John Stuart Mill argues that without freedom of speech, you will have no progress in science, in law, in politics. You must have a free and open discussion of opinion. Truth, Mill believed, drives out falsehood. I wanted for us to take a look at some of the quotations from this book. Here's Mill's wife, who was an early feminist in 19th century England. Mill said this: "The only freedom which deserves a name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs, or impede their efforts to obtain it." This is what Mill called the harm principle, all right? If you're not harming someone, then you should have the freedom to do it, okay? If you want to be in the 19th century, opium was a big trade. You want to be an opium addict. You're harming yourself, but you're not harming others, so you should have the liberty to do it. Whatever crushes individuality, Mill argued, is despotism. So this slide here gives you just a hint, a look, a window into Mill's general political philosophy. Whatever crushes individuality is despotism, the harm principle. Now, Mill said this: "There ought to exist the fullest liberty of professing and discussing, as a matter of ethical conviction, any doctrine, however immoral it may be considered." So this is what some might say, call it an absolutist position on the idea of freedom of speech. The fullest liberty. If all man, this is quite a quote, "If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had all the power, would be justified in silencing mankind." You can see why John Stuart Mill was an effective thinker, effective writer. You may disagree with that sentence, but wow, quite powerfully stated. Truth gains more, this is interesting, truth gains more even by the errors of one who, with due study and preparation, thinks for himself, than by the true opinions of those who only hold them because they do not suffer themselves to think. Great quotation. If the censored opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Again, another eloquently stated defense of the fullest extent of liberty granted to expression and to speech. So this first part is obvious. Obviously, if the censored opinion is correct, and this is awful, you're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. But what if the opinion's wrong? Still there's a loss, because the ability for people to articulate wrong ideas, erroneous ideas, deprives truth of the benefit of there being a clear perception of it, of truth, because the collision with error sharpens truth, and it affords those who hold a true opinion the opportunity to see why it's true, how it's true, and why the erroneous opinion is false. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them, but if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. This is a problem in many of today's universities. Many of universities today do not have much diversity of opinion. There's a uniformity of opinion in much of academia today, and of course academia is not the only one. There are many institutions around the country today. There's a uniformity of opinion. If you only know your own side of the case, and if you've never been given the opportunity to try to refute the opposite side, you're doing yourself a disfavor, not to mention the opposing side. There is the greatest difference between presuming an opinion to be true because, with every opportunity for contesting it, it has not been refuted, and assuming its truth for the purpose of not permitting its refutation. Complete liberty of contradicting and disproving our opinion is the very condition which justifies us in assuming its truth. We can never be sure that the opinion we are endeavoring to stifle is a false opinion, and if we were sure, stifling it would be an evil still. How many times in human history has the general opinion of mankind been wrong? Okay? Has there ever been a time in human history where society just got everything right? Where there wasn't an idea that ended up later being true that in that day and age was very unpopular or held by only a very, very small number of people. But every generation thinks that they've got it, that they've arrived, and the generations later disprove that arrogance, but then have the same arrogance themselves. Ages are no more infallible than individuals, every age having held many opinions, which subsequent ages have deemed not only false, but absurd. Think of it, I'm just going to pause there. He's writing in 1859. How many ideas in 1859 do we look at today and just see it not only false, but absurd? And it is as, he's predicting it right here. Mill is pretty genius. And it is as certain, I disagree with Mill on several key things, namely his utilitarianism and some other questions and several other important issues. But on this, I'm on board. And it is as certain that many opinions, now general, will be rejected by future ages, as it is that many, once general, are rejected by the present. History teems with instances of truth put down by persecution. Oh, man. Mr. Mill, you're impressing me here. On Liberty is a great text. You really ought to read the full text. Persons of genius, it is true, are always likely to be a small minority. But in order to have them, this is key, in order to have them, it is necessary to preserve the soil in which they grow. Genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. That's so key. So key. Genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. If you take away freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom to seek, to receive, to impart ideas, then you're removing the soil for persons of genius, for the innovator, for the creative mind. And then we have this. The usefulness of an opinion is itself matter of opinion. There is in society, he says, a, quote, tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling. Tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling. That's true of any age. Any age. It's John Stuart Mill. What about George Orwell? Real name, of course, Eric Blair. Well, George Orwell in the 1940s was writing Animal Farm. If you haven't read Animal Farm, you really need to. Animal Farm, of course, George Orwell was living in the United Kingdom, and he was writing during a time in which the UK was allied during war with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. And at this time, many within the British intelligentsia held Stalin in some esteem, and there was a bit of a Russophilia or Sovietophilia that permeated much of the British intelligentsia, and Orwell absolutely despised that. Well, Animal Farm, it was obvious he was critiquing the Soviet Union. He was critiquing Stalinism and Sovietism. And the manuscript, believe it or not, was initially rejected by a number of publishers. Well, the original preface to Animal Farm, this is in 1944, Orwell responds to this, to these obstacles that he's encountering in trying to publish this book. He said this, quote, "At any given moment, there's an orthodoxy, a body of ideas which it is assumed that all right-thinking people will accept without question. It is not exactly forbidden to say this, that, or the other, but it is not done to say it. Just as in mid-Victorian times, it was not done to mention trousers in the presence of a lady. Anyone who challenges the prevailing orthodoxy finds himself silenced with surprising effectiveness. a genuinely unfashionable opinion. And this is the key qualifier here. Genuinely. We have so many artificially unfashionable opinions that are actually fashionable that go around and people think they're rebellious for articulating, but they're actually not. They're conforming to the corporate consensus. A genuinely unfashionable opinion is almost never given a fair hearing, either in the popular press or in the highbrow periodicals. Great quote from George Orwell. Well, what about, moving on a little bit, what about politically dangerous speech? Politically dangerous speech. Here's a picture of Congress, actually, the floor of the United States Congress in the 1790s. The 1790s in U.S. politics is highly partisan. You had the Federalist Party, and then you had the Democratic Republican Party, and they hated each other. One was represented by Jefferson, the other by Hamilton. Now, the First Amendment, which was authorized in 1791, said Congress cannot abridge the freedom of speech. And yet, in 1798, the Federalist Party, which controlled the legislative branch, controlled the executive branch through John Adams, and controlled the judiciary, passed the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act said that anyone who impeded the policies of the government or falsely defamed government officials, including the president, would be liable to either a heavy fine or to imprisonment. Well, in the aftermath of the Sedition Act, many newspaper editors were arrested and indicted, convicted by packed juries, and swayed by Federalist judges. Many of them were Democratic Republicans who opposed the Federalist Party. One of the persons who was arrested was a sitting congressman, Matthew Lyon. He was sentenced to 4 months in jail because he wrote of John Adams, and he said this about John Adams. He criticized his, quote, unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. That landed him 4 months in jail. This only 7 years after the First Amendment in 1791. Of course, that was later repealed. During the American Civil War, again, politically dangerous speech. How do you handle dissenting speech during time of war? Abraham Lincoln cracked down pretty hard. There were many newspaper editors in the North who were arrested for criticizing Lincoln or for openly sympathizing with the Confederacy. And of course, habeas corpus was the right of habeas corpus was also suspended. During World War I, under Woodrow Wilson, Congress passed the Espionage Act. And according to the Espionage Act, you would receive a sentence of 20 years in jail if you caused or attempted to cause, quote, insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States. Well, this was interpreted quite broadly, and hundreds of prosecutions followed of people who spoke out against the war. And in fact, the socialists, the famous socialist and presidential candidate Eugene Debs, gave a speech against the war and was indicted under the Espionage Act. Well, one of these men decided to sue and take it to court. He was a Socialist Party official. This is not the man. This is Oliver Wendell Holmes. But he's a Socialist Party official. His name was Charles Schenck. And Charles Schenck was convicted for publishing leaflets urging that people resist the draft. Schenck argued that his arrest under the Espionage Act violated his First Amendment rights. The Supreme Court, under the leadership of Oliver Wendell Holmes, upheld the conviction by establishing a very famous test. And a test is a sort of a bar that the court relies upon when making a decision. And Holmes said, if something presents a, quote, clear and present danger to the government, then that speech can be prohibited. and so he upheld the conviction. And then in another case, the court upheld Eugene Debs' conviction, arguing that the speech had a, quote, natural tendency and a probable effect to obstruct the recruiting services, end quote. Pretty remarkable. During World War II, we're just on the eve of the United States entry into World War II. In 1940, Congress passed the Smith Act. The Smith Act made it illegal to advocate the, quote, the propriety of overthrowing or destroying any government in the United States by force and violence. This act was then used to arrest communist, fascist, and anarchist leaders within the United States. Approximately 215 people, mostly communists, approximately 215 people were arrested under the Smith Act. One of those was Eugene Dennis. Eugene Dennis was General Secretary of the Communist Party USA. Eugene Dennis was arrested in 1948 under the Smith Act. The Supreme Court upheld the conviction and said that applied Holmes's clear and present danger test to the case, and argued that Dennis did not have a right to free speech, publication, or assembly because his exercise of that right involved some sort of abstractly, perhaps, creation of a plot to overthrow the government. And so that this was a clear and present danger, that you had a communist party operating within the United States that might overthrow the government. Even though Dennis was not actively engaged in trying to overthrow the government. Well, that was overturned in 1957. A separate case, Yates versus the United States. The Supreme Court ruled, basically overturned the Smith Act for all intents and purposes, by saying that prosecutions, political prosecutions, can only be limited to advocacy of action, okay, rather than advocacy in the realm of ideas. So Dennis was advocacy in the realm of ideas. The Supreme Court had upheld his conviction in 1951. Now the Supreme Court's changing its tune a bit and says, no, wait, it's got to be advocacy of action. Advocacy of ideas, of abstract doctrine, that's protected speech. Okay? If you're explicitly urging, we must overthrow the government now and come up with all these plans, right? That's not protected. That is not protected. And that's the sedition that you remember at the beginning of this lecture when we talked about the limitations. That's the sedition. Okay? But, and like Eugene Dennis, no, you have that right, so long as it remains in the abstract. Another big critical freedom of speech case occurs in 1969. Clarence Brandenburg was a Ku Klux Klan leader in rural Ohio. And in 1964, he participated in a rally, and he made some highly incendiary comments about African Americans and Jews. He argued that for the forced expulsion of blacks to Africa and of Jews to Israel. Well, he was charged with advocating violence. The Supreme Court reversed his conviction. And in doing so, really important case actually in the history of freedom of speech in the United States. In doing so, they replaced the clear and present danger test with a new test, imminent lawless action. And this remains a standard, the barometer used by the court today. It said, the court ruled that government cannot punish inflammatory speech unless it is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or cause such action. Now, word imminent means impending. It may occur at any moment, okay? And that's the new standard, imminent lawless action. This, in effect, makes the freedom of political speech almost absolute. Not 100% absolute, but almost absolute. And because of these Supreme Court cases, especially the Brandenburg case, the United States has the strongest safeguards of freedom of speech anywhere in the world, bar none. It's really no contest, including among, if you compare the U.S. with the U.K. or with Europe. Another very, very controversial case that followed in 1977, National Socialist Party of America versus the village of Skokie. A neo-Nazi group was planning to hold a demonstration at a public park in Chicago, and nearby this park was their headquarters. So this is a park in Chicago located near their headquarters. Well, the city of Chicago blocked it. They attempted to impose a $350,000 insurance bond and then ban political demonstrations in the park. So the NSPA weighed whether or not they wanted to sue the city of Chicago, decided against it, were afraid of getting bogged down in the courts, and so they attempted to find another park. And so they sent letters to other park districts in the northern suburbs of Chicago. They were ignored by all of them except one. The village of Skokie responded. Skokie is located in Cook County, and the village of Skokie responded and said that they could have their demonstration. And the hope here was that just let them have their little demonstration. They were a small group, and it will receive little publicity and not a big deal. The mayor and the village council agreed to this. Well, Skokie happened to also be a community with a large Jewish population, including people who had survived the Holocaust. When members of the local community found out that the mayor and the council had done this, they strongly objected and persuaded the mayor and council to essentially change their mind. And the mayor and council issued sought an injunction from a court to prevent this march, this demonstration, from happening. Well, the lower courts, the circuit court, and then the Illinois Supreme Court took on the case, and the National Socialist Party had the benefit of attorneys from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU, a left-wing group, liberal group. You wouldn't see the ACLU do this today. 1970s, the ACLU would take on a case like this. Today, not the case. But in 1977, the ACLU said, all right, we'll represent you. And they've made it clear, we disagree vehemently with the ideas of this group. We detest their ideas, but they have a right to vocalize those ideas. They have a right to have a public demonstration. So the ACLU represented them. The NSPA lost in the lower courts. Then it went to the Supreme Court. And at the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court lifted the injunction on the march and ruled in against the village of Skokie. Ultimately, the Nazis failed to march in Skokie, but marched in Chicago instead at a later date when they had gained permission. But that was a 5-4 ruling in the Supreme Court, 5-4, so pretty narrowly decided. But this was a fairly extreme case in which you have a group of people who reviled by also, large majority of the population, and yet ACLU's Supreme Court say no, they have the right to demonstrate. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who defended the Espionage Act, did say this about the First Amendment. He said the First Amendment is not just about protecting, quote, free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. And this was the ACLU's position. Protecting free thought, including for free thought for those that free thought that we hate. You may have heard the expression, I hate what you have to say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. Now this brings us to the question of offensive speech. Today you hear a lot of challenges to the First Amendment, saying that it's antiquated and it's not properly equipped to counter hate speech. Some people believe that the harm principle, remember John Stuart Mill's idea, the harm principle, that bar for what speech is appropriate and what isn't, that bar is too high, and that it should be limited not just to physical harm, but also to non-physical harm, emotional harm, and such. And so this question of hate speech, but the main problem here for the advocates of hate speech laws is this: who defines offensive speech? And that's the million-dollar question. Who defines offensive speech? For example, in many countries, several countries around the world, blaspheming or defaming Muhammad is prohibited and could get you the death sentence. In France, blasphemy is protected under free speech, but then you had the Charlie Hebdo shooting. From the perspective of these countries that outlaw blaspheming Muhammad, blasphemy, that's hate speech. That's highly offensive speech. And so they've defined that, and that's prohibited. And lest you think I'm picking on one religious group, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 24, there was a man in the Israelite camp when they were out in the wilderness, and he blasphemed the name of the Lord, Yahweh. He was consequently stoned by the congregation, because there was a commandment in ancient Israel: whoever, quote, blasphemes the name shall be put to death. That was hate speech. That was offensive speech. In Russia today, hate speech laws, as they would be called there, have been used to justify suppressing LGBT propaganda, as they define it, as the Russian government defines it, restricting speech related to LGBT issues. The name of that law in Russia restricting LGBT speech is a law, quote, for the purpose of protecting children from information advocating for a denial of traditional family values. And so LGBT speech for many people in Russia, that's offensive speech, that's hate speech, and so it has to be prohibited. A number of European countries outlaw speech that might be interpreted as Holocaust denial. Many countries also have made it illegal to deny the Armenian genocide. In Germany, you can face imprisonment from between 3 months to 5 years. Many people in most Western democracies, including the United Kingdom, they have laws restricting hate speech. Again, the United States does not have hate speech laws, and that makes us one of the only ones. But again, the problem is who defines? And hate speech and offensive speech is highly, highly subjective. In fact, it would be hard to think of a more subjective criterion than hate speech laws or offensive speech laws. It's vague. It's not easily interpreted or defined, and the boundaries are porous. They can just shift altogether. And what was offensive speech one day may not be offensive the other, or vice versa. And so this principle, free speech advocates say, look, okay, because of this reality that some speech will be offensive to others and some speech won't be offensive to others, and you can't define it, and it's subjective, because of that reality, we've got to settle on this general principle. Many in the old left, well, they were the new left in the 1960s, but those who are still around today, it's more the old school left, have retained this belief in freedom of speech. This is from Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky. Quote, if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. Dictators such as Stalin and Hitler were in favor of freedom of speech for views they liked only. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Now, that doesn't mean the objection out there, well, what about there are consequences for speech? Yes, there are consequences for speech. There are enormous consequences for speech. Nobody denies that. This is from John Stuart Mill. We have a right also in various ways to act upon our unfavorable opinion of anyone, not to the oppression of his individuality, but in the exercise of ours. We are not bound, for example, to seek his society. We have a right to avoid it. So if there's someone who's saying something just terrible, hateful, like totally objectionable, you are not bound to get along with this guy. You're not bound to fraternize with him. You can avoid him. You can be ostracized from polite society, from the rest of respectable the respectable population. For we have a right to choose the society most acceptable to us. We have a right, and it may be our duty, to caution others against him. So if there's someone advancing terrible ideas, you have a right to warn others and say, hey, look, this guy he's a bigot. Stay away from him. That's within your right. That's within your liberty. We have a right, and it may be our duty, to caution others against him if we think his example or conversation likely to have a pernicious effect on those with whom he associates. A person who shows rashness, obstinacy, self-conceit, who cannot live within moderate means, who cannot restrain himself from hurtful indulgences, who pursues animal pleasures at the expense of those of feeling and intellect, must expect to be lowered in the opinion of others and to have a less share of their favorable sentiments. Again, classic Mill. He's right 1,000%, right? You are not entitled to just say anything you want and face zero social consequences. You will receive social consequences. You should receive social consequences. However, that is a different matter altogether than saying that the state come down on you. And why is that a distinction with a difference? Because the state has a monopoly on force. The state can use force of arms, has police power, military power, can arrest you, and can convict you in a court of law. I can't, right? I may find your views abhorrent, but I don't have the power to do all those things. The state does. And so that's the important difference. So, the people who advocate this need to think long and hard about some of the implications of what they're saying, because it may target speech they don't like now, but how long will it be before it targets speech they do agree with? Of course, in our day, and I'm going to have to save this for a separate video because we've gone long. The big question is the tech monopoly, okay? Because censorship, more and more, is not coming from the state. It's coming from corporate power, monopolistic big tech power. What do we do about that? That's a huge challenge. And I'm going to make a separate video about that at a later date. My opinion is that something must be done. I see a lot of libertarian types who say, oh, it's not a big deal. I could not disagree more, actually. But I want to save that for a different discussion because that deserves its own separate video. So we'll deal with that at a later date. But what we're seeing right now about fact-checking articles in such a way that ends up suppressing ideas, including Oxford professors, epidemiologists who say things a Facebook fact checker with no credentials doesn't like, or apps that might challenge big tech monopolies on thought and clientele, and being able to just eliminate it with that's a subject that deserves more attention. Notice parler. What does that mean in the French? To speak. The French and the Latin. Parler in the French means to speak. Je parle. I speak. I took 4 years of French in high school. I don't remember much of it. Although it's funny when you go to a foreign country abroad and you knew that language like 10 years ago, like just a little bit of it, it kind of starts to come back to you like riding a bike. But that is a serious issue. And a plug laptop there. I didn't realize it was unplugged. This is great. This was a cartoon against monopolies, industrial monopolies in the at the beginning of the 20th century. And when this is today, when Twitter, Google, Facebook come to testify before Congress. I'll get to that later. So this is important. And this is why the big tech monopoly is dangerous. Because if big tech companies decide what you can and cannot say and share on their platforms, then what good is any of this? You can't seek information. You can't receive information. You can't impart information. I'll conclude with two articles here. One that favors the hate speech law, and the other that is very pro First Amendment. This was published, this was an op-ed published in the Washington Post on October 29th, 2019. The author was Richard Stengel, and he worked in the Obama State Department between 2013 and 2016. Well, he authored this op-ed a little over a year ago, titled "Why America Needs This Hate Speech Law." Let's see what he has to say. As a government official traveling around the world, championing the virtues of free speech, I came to see how our First Amendment standard is an outlier. Even the most sophisticated Arab diplomats that I dealt with did not understand why the First Amendment allows someone to burn a Quran. Why, they asked me, would you ever want to protect that? The First Amendment, he said, quote, should not protect hateful speech that can cause violence by one group against another. In an age when everyone has a megaphone, that seems like a design flaw. So he's saying that the internet has changed things. By the way, there were similar arguments were made with the Gutenberg printing press. Remember that graph with all those new books? The censors said, whoa, there's way too many ideas out there. We can't control them. We must censor. We have to. We must have licenses. These same arguments were made back in the 16th and 17th centuries in response to the printing press. The intellectual underpinning of the First Amendment was engineered for a simpler era. Simpler era when a billion books, a billion copies of books were being printed and disseminated. The author of this piece underestimates just how much speech there was in the 18th century. The amendment rests on the notion that the truth will win out in the, quote, marketplace of ideas. The framers believed that this marketplace was necessary for people to make informed choices in a democracy. Somehow, magically, truth would emerge. The presumption has always been that the marketplace would offer a level playing field. But in the age of social media, that landscape is neither level nor fair. Actually, I would say it's more fair than ever in a way, because you don't have to go through a gatekeeper publisher. If anyone is able to communicate ideas, actually that is a more level playing field in a very literal way than ever before, because there's no gatekeeper. Now, that might still be bad, but to say that it's not a level playing field is odd. It doesn't really make sense exactly. But in the age of social media, that landscape is neither level nor fair. On the internet, truth is not optimized. On the web, it's not enough to battle falsehood with truth. The truth does not always win. What did Milton say? You're doubting the strength of truth if you make this argument. Remember Milton? He's writing. John Milton was writing when the printing press, churning out all sorts of new books, and people are saying we can't have it. Said, are you doubting the strength of truth? Hate speech, quote, diminishes tolerance. It enables discrimination. Isn't that, by definition, speech that undermines the values that the First Amendment was designed to protect? Fairness, due process, equality before the law. Why shouldn't the states experiment with their own version of hate speech statutes to penalize speech that deliberately insults people based on religion, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation? Well, the answer to your question, sir, is that it's unconstitutional. The First Amendment says Congress cannot prohibit freedom of speech, and then the incorporation of the Bill of Rights in the 14th Amendment says clarifies that this is also applicable to the states. And so states may not experiment, actually, with their own version of hate speech statutes. The courts have ruled otherwise. It's unconstitutional. And that's just a constitutional argument. Not to mention it's not effective. It doesn't work. It can lead to bad results. All speech is not equal, and where truth cannot drive out lies, well, we agree with that. All speech isn't equal. There's garbage speech out there. Nobody disagrees with that. The question is, do you criminalize it? All speech is not equal, and where truth cannot drive out lies, we must add new guardrails. I'm all for protecting, quote, thought that we hate, that's Oliver Wendell Holmes, but not speech that incites hate. Wait, that doesn't make, okay. That you just contradicted yourself there. It undermines the very values of a fair marketplace of ideas that the First Amendment is designed to protect. Going back to Noam Chomsky, and then we'll wrap up here. Earlier in 2020, I think it was in July of 2020, Noam Chomsky teamed up with J.K. Rowling and a bunch of others and signed off on a statement that was published in Harper's Magazine called A Letter on Justice and Open Debate, July 7th, 2020, and it caused quite a stir. They began the letter by applauding the, quote, powerful protests for racial and social justice that had taken place in the previous months. But, they said, this needed reckoning over social justice has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. And that's so key. Conformity has never been more fashionable, in my lifetime at least, than what we see today. Ideological conformity. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world. Resistance to those illiberal forces, which Chomsky and Rowling and the other signatories, they throw Donald Trump into that group and the rise of the populist right. Resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and a tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counter speech from all quarters. But it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought, what Orwell would call it thought crime. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study. And heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk aversion among writers, artists, and journalists who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement. So that's actually a really great point here, that greater risk aversion. What does that mean? It means writers and artists, people and journalists and intellectuals, people who society needs to be, to be risky and to put their necks out there and pose ideas that are going to be controversial or maybe unpopular. They have greater risk aversion now. Society suffers as a result. Because if any of these people depart from the consensus, depart from the ideological conformity, or even lack sufficient zeal and agreement, it's over. They're done. They're canceled. The restriction of debate, whether by repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. That's the thing. These people who support this restriction of freedom of speech, the restriction of freedom of speech is being spearheaded by the most powerful. The irony is lost, I think, on many of these people. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. This reminds me of a quote from George Orwell, one of my favorites. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Take away freedom of speech and the creative faculties dry up. 100%. Oh man, that's so. It's just insightful. Take away freedom of speech and creative faculties dry up. George Orwell. Why do you think the Soviet Union it didn't have its art and architecture and music in the 20th century? It was just not on par with what you saw in the West in the 1950s and the 1960s and through the rest of the centuries. Well, they didn't have the freedom that we had in the West. Also, look at what's going on in China right now. Okay? China, controlled by a communist party, although I'm of the opinion that the Chinese government resembles fascism far more than it does communism. In China, they have the most comprehensive internet censorship in the world. I mean, it's sophisticated, just powerful AI algorithms that police and remove content and monitor internet activity, block website content. China has the largest recorded number of journalists imprisoned, cyber dissidents. If you're communicating with organized groups abroad, or if you're involved in a controversial online petition, or just even calling for government reform, the censorship is extremely strict. So, and I don't think I have to tell you that China is a rising power and may even eclipse the United States and Europe in the 21st century. And if that's the case, and the most powerful country in the world suddenly is one where there is no freedom of speech at all, we're headed for some big trouble if we cannot counter with our own vigorous defense of freedom. So just as when the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, the United States was able to present a united front, at least on the subject of basic liberal freedoms. Okay, had a lot of disagreements about a whole lot of subjects, obviously, during the Cold War period within the United States. There's no question about that. But there was a rigorous defense of core liberal values that we were able to distinguish ourselves from the Soviet Union. We have to do that in this 21st century. We must reassert our commitment to freedom of speech, because it is the only way that we're going to see true progress occur within our nation and worldwide in this upcoming century. Okay, that's all I have. I know it was a long lecture. It's okay. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you next time for whatever topic. We'll have to do what we talk about. Until then, God bless, and talk to you all later. Bye.